Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our series Fixing Democracy, I'm going to be talking to the political scientist Nic Cheeseman, who has spent many years studying election practice and malpractice around the world, from Africa to America, looking at the ways that governments try to rig elections and exploring how to stop them. This is a conversation about what makes an election free and fair, and some of the things that we can do to try to guarantee that it happens wherever you are. So, Nic, we're going to be talking about all of the many different ways in which elections can be skewed, rigged, not fair around the world. There is a lot of it. You've written very widely about this. I think it's one of those subjects we should probably start by just setting out what it is that we're talking about. So when people hear about a fixed election, they probably picture stuffed ballot boxes. That is the traditional way of doing it. And some of that still goes on. But we're living in a world where there is quite a variety of different ways in which elections can be unfair. Maybe one way to start this conversation is for me to ask you, are we talking about a spectrum here? So is this something where you can say, of all of the varieties of elections around the world, you can place them on a spectrum of fair to unfair? Or is it more complicated than that?
I think a spectrum is a great way to think about it. We have some elections that are rigged from start to finish, right? You are not actually allowed to campaign as an opposition leader. You're blocked from going to some parts of the country. You find that your supporters are being intimidated every day by the military and the police. People actually go to the polling station and find out that the result is posted on the door of the polling station before the votes have actually been counted, right? That's one side. Then you've got, the other end where actually, people feel very free. The opposition have, roughly the same amount of money as the government. The media is relatively free and diverse. People cast their ballots. The Electoral Commission does a good job. Now, it's important to note that even at that kind of best case scenario, we're not saying there's a level playing field, right? Because governments typically have massive advantages over opposition parties, even in the best case election scenario. They might have more money. They've got better connections often to business if they're in power. They're often more able to determine the electoral cycle and the media agenda. So governments almost always have a bit of an advantage going into an election from that. But we're not calling that election rigging because that's generally understood to be part of the kind of democratic process. So we're really zeroing in on those things that are kind of illegitimate, illegal, clearly systematic attempts to manipulate the outcome of the election in one place. And so the things that often are kind of in the middle of that aren't fully on the rigging side and aren't fully on the free and fair side are things like media freedom. In a lot of elections around the world, most of the media is controlled by the ruling party or by people who are close to the ruling party. So the information that citizens get is very skewed. Yet that's very rarely used as a reason to say an election was completely unfree by international observers, for example, or international media. We've also got strategies such as vote buying, which are kind of again in the middle. We know that it's wrong for people to buy votes, and you could see this either through, say, what Elon Musk did at the last election by clearly providing financial incentives for people to demonstrate and get involved in the Donald Trump campaign, all the way through to people literally standing on street corners handing you a small note. But again, that doesn't tend to be something that's seen as being as bad as what you were talking about, which is the actual ballot rigging itself. And one of the things that's important to say here is that we actually do still see quite a lot of examples of this. So we're talking about scenarios where I might get something like, 40,000 votes. You might get something like, 300,000 votes. And then somebody comes along and Tipexes off, one of your zeros. So all of a sudden you've got 30,000 and I've got 40,000. And that might sound remarkable. It might sound implausible that still happens. But we actually saw an election in Malawi in 2019, which became known as the Tipex Gate election, because what was shared on social media were images of official results sheets where somebody had clearly used whiteout fluid to take out some of the numbers and add in or write in new numbers. And I actually showed this in the case of Uganda, right? In the last Ugandan elections, the Ugandan Electoral Commission issued a ballot paper that it claimed, a result sheet online that it claimed corrected former misinformation about how it had manipulated the elections. But one of the things you could see very clearly from that result sheet was that they had actually deleted the first digit of the result for the main opposition candidate, Bobby Wine. So let's say he actually got 180. What they'd done is deleted with whiteout fluid the 1 and reduced him to 80. And you could see this because the digits for all the results were in line. So all of the results started in line on the left-hand column, but his started one number in because the whiteout had moved the 1. And the other results at the bottom, the things like, how many voters turned out, were no longer correct because, of course, if you take away 100 votes from one candidate, you have to take 100 away from the number of people who cast ballots. So these crude mechanisms are still operating today, but as you said, hand in hand with a new range of digital techniques, which takes electoral manipulation to the next level.
So I want to talk about that middle ground because in many ways that's very interesting, and also how far it stretches towards the democracies that we are more familiar with in the West, including our own. But at the other end of the spectrum, the really blatant end, so the thing you've just described, it makes you sort of think, how did they think they would get away with it? Maybe they didn't care whether they would get away with it. But it feels like there's a trade-off at that extreme end. The example you gave, you go to the polling station and the result is already on the door before you get there. So a lot of this is about what those in power are trying to signal. So on the one hand, you might think, why do tyrants and dictators want elections at all? Well, there's a cloak of legitimacy to that. And yet at the same time, if you're going to make a mockery of it, it's a very warped kind of legitimacy. So what do you think is being signaled in those regimes where, on the one hand, you do go through the whole performance of having an election, and at the same time, pretty little effort is made to plausibly present this as something in which there was free and fair competition? What are they doing, those regimes?
So I think even if you're not getting a legitimacy boost, even if that's not happening, there is a real value to holding elections. And one of those, I think, is that actually it's easier to divide and rule your opposition if you're holding elections than if you don't. So think about a lot of the countries, let's say sub-Saharan Africa. In the late 1980s, we saw these massive movements in favor of the end of the one-party state and the introduction of multi-party democracy. And what a lot of them were called things like the Forum for the Restoration of Democracy, to give you an example from Kenya. They were united because they had a common enemy, which was the one-party state or the person they saw was a dictator at the time. And in doing so, you had vast proportions of society, cross business, civil society, people who didn't have anything else in common, coming together as a united front in favor of some kind of change. That changed almost immediately when leaders accepted elections. Why? Because all of a sudden, from having a common position against a leader, against the one-party state, people had to compete. And of course, they wanted power for themselves. So take the Forum for the Restoration of Democracy that I was just talking about in Kenya. It divides along personality lines, two different leaders. It divides in some senses along ethnic lines. And so we see two different versions of that party, two different versions of that exact same movement competing in the elections, dividing the opposition. And the existing president, President Moi, who'd been there during the one-party state, ends up winning that election against that divided opposition, not because he wins a lot of votes, but because the opposition divide their support. And along with all the things we've been talking about, repression, vote buying, and so on, the president, Daniel Moi, manages to stay in power. So I think one of the things we often miss is that value of actually being able to play divide and rule and the way that elections can play into that. It's also true, of course, that while we've talked about some of the most obvious and blatant forms of election rigging, a lot of electoral manipulation is much more subtle than that, is harder to identify. And in those cases, of course, you can get that domestic and international legitimacy boost of having been elected by your people. And at the same time, that can then translate into other things, such as greater access to international financial assistance, greater ability to present yourself as an esteemed world leader in the club of democracies. Now, that might be less relevant today than it was in the past, right? Because at the minute, we don't have a world dominated by democracy. We have a world that's becoming increasingly authoritarian. But certainly in the 1990s, that was also a big incentive to hold elections.
In political science, sometimes people try and identify a threshold, a cutoff point beyond which you can say, and often it's a minimal definition, this thing that we have here is minimally free and fair. So there's a spectrum and there's a range of practices. Some of them are blatant, some of them are subtle. Often, presumably, it's a mix of the two. But do you also think on that spectrum, it's possible to identify some very straightforward tests so that on one side of that line, we can say minimally, this is free and fair? And usually, I think in political science, it's to do with the nature of the competition and, frankly, the possibility of the incumbents losing. Even if it's unlikely they'll lose, is it possible?
I think you just hit the nail on the head. I think that's where we can draw the line. And it's not a perfect line. We could debate whether that's the right line or whether that's not a demanding enough standard to say an election is decent. But I think that point about the opposition can actually win if people line up behind them in a certain way is a good one. So I would say let's go back to free and fair. What do we mean? Right? I would say fair means that the outcome of the election, the results that are announced by the Electoral Commission, are basically a reflection of the votes that were cast. That's basically necessary because unless you have that, no matter how well you do as a political party, you can find out that you haven't won power at the end of the day. And the second is if we think about free, like what is the bare minimum of free? I would say that voters can go and cast their ballots without fear of violence and intimidation and reprisals for voting for the wrong party in the eyes of the government. I think if you have those two things, you can see opposition parties win. So let me give you an example of that. The last Zambian elections, 2021. This was not a free and fair election by perfect standards. We had media being heavily biased towards the ruling party. We had the opposition struggling to campaign in some parts of the country. We had the use of all sorts of strategies from vote buying to repression, intimidation, etc. But the opposition won in a landslide. Why? Because ultimately the process of translating those votes into seats in parliament and into the presidential election outcome was done legitimately and fairly, and because ultimately citizens believed that they could go and cast ballots and they would not suffer too many violent reprisals, and that the results of that would be respected. And so they felt motivated to go and do it. So you can have election results that actually give power to the opposition in those situations. And I think that's a pretty good place to draw the line. Where is it feasible for the opposition to win if everything aligns for them? Where is it essentially impossible for them to win? And there are a lot of countries around the world today where, despite having multi-party elections for 20, 30, 40 years, there has never been an opposition victory because it is structurally almost impossible for the opposition to win power.
Are there cases where, and maybe the example you just gave is one of those, where authoritarian regimes that see the advantage of holding elections, the legitimacy boost, divide and rule, the things that you've described, but also have absolutely no intention of giving up power, nonetheless find that once you go down the path of holding elections, you do lose some control. If you're going to have something which is even minimally plausible, there is a limit to how much you control it. So I'm thinking of people like Erdogan, for instance. So there's a regime in Turkey where he's been in power for a long time. There have been a whole series of elections, and it seems very hard for the opposition to get him out. But there have been elections in the period he's been in power, including some local rather than national elections, urban elections, where he has been surprised by the result. Is that a feature that we see, that there is a trade-off almost for the authoritarian, and going down the route of fake elections almost by definition introduces some jeopardy?
Yeah, I think it does. And the Turkish example is a good one. And as you say, in elections like, for example, in Istanbul, he has not been able to control those outcomes as well. And that has then generated a lot of controversy when the regime has been forced to do different methods that are basically undemocratic in order to try and reverse those results or prevent opposition from gaining a foothold in urban areas. So that's a really great example. And I think there are others. We can see that, for example, think about Jammeh in Gambia. Nobody expected him to lose that election in 2016. This was a long-time dictator that people assumed was in power in a consolidated way. People in that country were voting with marbles, and you basically got a marble and you put it in the bucket of the person that you wanted to vote for. So you could see by where someone was standing who they were voting for, right? So actually, it wasn't that safe to vote for the opposition in this election. And yet the opposition came together. We saw unified opposition into a broad coalition, and people were sufficiently angry and motivated to actually be brave enough to vote for change. And ultimately, there was nothing that he could do. So it is true that you can be completely surprised by this. And actually, we see transfers of power, even in regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, where leaders win most of the time. We see people being surprised at the ballot box. But I think we probably do want to make a distinction between what I would call kind of semi-competitive elections and uncompetitive elections. We also have leaders who are winning with 95, 90, 88% of the vote, right? People, Putin, Paul Kagame in Rwanda, etc. We have leaders who are winning by 80, 90%. And that's because the election is structurally controlled from the beginning to the end. So, really good quality, strong opposition leaders are prevented from being on the ballot, often by using some kind of administrative guise to claim that they were not legitimate, or they didn't fill out the form properly, or they don't have the right certificate, or, they're not even actually truly from this country. They were actually born somewhere else, so they were not allowed to stand, all the way through to really intimidating voters and controlling the process, to completely controlling the media, to having the Electoral Commission in your pocket. And those elections where we see this leader winning, 90% plus over time, really don't offer that much of an opportunity for surprise. It can happen, once in a blue moon, but it's very rare that those elections generate those surprises. And it's interesting to me that that generates a kind of trade-off for leaders. So one of the things that we talk about is the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, who actually talks about the sort of trade-off between wanting to win big, so to demoralize the opposition, but wanting a result which he calls is kind of socially, psychologically acceptable. In other words, I don't want to look like a banana republic dictator by giving myself 99%, but I don't want to say that the election was close by saying I won 52%. I need a number that devastates the opposition and doesn't mean that observers come looking for evidence that maybe I manipulated it, a big enough number that it kind of puts people off investigating, but a low enough number that it's actually psychologically credible. So he actually argues that he's reduced the level of vote rigging in some elections to get down from a number that was too high to something that was better, something in maybe the high 70s, low 80s. That's the kind of number you want, but not in the 90s. So it's interesting, and I think this goes back to something you said earlier on. Leaders who are up in the 90s are really sending a different kind of signal. They're not sending the signal, I'm genuinely democratic, I want a competitive election, give me that democratic legitimacy. They're sending a very different signal, which is actually, I don't really care how you think about this. I don't really care what the international community thinks about this. I think I can get away with this. And what I really want to broadcast to you is that I'm in control, and that's going to be how it stays.
And I think we remember those Soviet bloc elections, which were essentially farcical, 99 point whatever percent, not signaling anything in terms of Western recognized democratic legitimacy. But presumably, once you start playing that game, it's still a variant of the same game. So you can be in charge in Belarus and think you're going to calibrate it so that you get your perfect results, 73.2%, 76.7%. But even if you're Putin and you're running these elections in Russia, and these are going to endorse you in a way that you feel crushes the opposition, there's still a difference between what you expect to get and what you might get. And presumably there are ways in which the opposition can signal we're not dead yet, not by winning, but by outperforming. Once it's not a complete fix, once there is some opportunity for voters to express dissatisfaction, no authoritarian can be completely confident that the opposition will not find a way of signalling you're not as popular as you think you are. And therefore, those elections do still serve a purpose, don't they?
And let me give you an example of how that can happen. So let's say even if you're going to fix the results, so you're going to control what people hear about in terms of the actual election results, you can suffer a big legitimacy loss because you can see that opposition rallies have twice as many people as your rallies. So if you've got a campaign that's doing a good job, one of the things they'll be doing is videoing all of their rallies and making it look like their rallies basically have more people than they do. This is a game both parties play, and this is true all over the world. Even in democracies, you'll get both parties claiming millions of people turned up for their event and no one turned up for the opposition. You can remember Trump's obsession with the size of the inauguration crowd, right? This is not just something that happens in less democratic states, although, of course, we can talk later about whether the United States is still a democracy. But that game is something that opposition parties can win, and people will see and know in their areas if the opposition rally had twice as many people at it than the ruling party rally, if people are leaving the ruling party rally because they're so frustrated and bored by it, and it's captured on cameras, and then the result comes out and the ruling party is said to have won. People are not stupid, right? People understand what has happened. They know that the opposition probably won the election and the ruling party has manipulated it. So I think you're right that even in those really tightly controlled elections, that process can send a signal that actually demonstrates to the population who has really won. And here I think one of the things that is really important is, whether citizens really believe that going to the ballot box can make a difference. So let me give you an example. I talked a moment ago about Zambia, where people have defeated the ruling party at the ballot box multiple times. So 1991, the former president of the one-party state, Kaunda, was defeated at the ballot box. There was a win by the opposition. 2011, we saw a second transfer of power. So by 2021, Zambians had experienced being able to do that twice already. They went to the ballot box with confidence, even though they knew the process wasn't free and fair. They still believed that enough of them went, they could get a big enough win for the opposition, the government would have to go. Compare that with somewhere like Uganda, for example, or Rwanda, where presidents have removed term limits, in the Ugandan case, removed age limits on the presidency, so they're set up for being presidents for life, where there hasn't ever been a transfer of power via the ballot box, and where surveys tell us that a majority of citizens do not believe you can actually change the government through the ballot box. In those cases, I think it's really hard for the opposition, because even when people see that the opposition are more popular, even when people see the opposition have more people at their rallies, there's not that much of an incentive to go to the ballot box if you don't really believe that you can actually affect change, if you don't think they're ever going to let you win. And so I think there's a little bit of a difference there between those countries. It's almost like in democratic memory. It's like the memory of actually having achieved something through the ballot box generates that willingness to go and try and do it again. And if you haven't had that breakthrough, it's much harder, I think, for opposition parties to actually make people believe that it's possible.
That example that you gave, that in an election, even though the election is in many ways rigged, there are things that opposition campaigns can do during the campaign, including filming rallies, having a record. You talked earlier about the example of stuff that can be put online showing that the number one had been Tipexed out. We're talking about this now in a digital age. Well, on the one hand, digital technology gives incumbent regimes a whole new array of techniques to manipulate and fix elections. But on the other hand, it also empowers citizens. I mean, we see this across the board in democracies, right? It's almost like an arms race. Is digital technology good for democracy or bad for democracy? It's both. We know it's both. It depends in whose hands it is. But when you look at that contest now, do you think that the advantages still primarily lie with the incumbents and their ability to manipulate this technology? Or do you think that in countries where elections are, on the whole, pretty unfair, this technology has given opposition parties and activists and individuals power to expose what's going on? Where do you see the arms race?
I think in general, it's probably, especially at the beginning, it did empower opposition parties. One of the conversations I've had with a lot of opposition leaders and candidates across different regions is that essentially before digital technology, the ruling party would control the main public broadcaster, it would control most of the newspaper and most of the radio. And especially in poorer societies, radio control is really important because that's actually the form of media that most people get, more than the internet, more than television still today. And that because you would have a ruling party with monopoly over that, you couldn't get your message out. And if disinformation was spread about you, and disinformation was not created by digital technology, right? It's existed since human beings started to do politics. you couldn't respond. There was no mechanism for you to respond. What we have today, they say to me, is we have a situation where we're fighting a war of disinformation, but we can speak back. If somebody says something about us on Twitter or TikTok or Instagram, we can post a message the next day that counteracts it, or 2 minutes later that counteracts it. And we can beat them by being viral. We can have the best messages and the most viral messages. I think about the election campaign, for example, Trump Clinton. Think about, recent election campaigns in Nigeria, where actually some of the most viral and most shared messages have been kind of anti the incumbent candidate or anti the candidate who, is coming from the ruling party, because they're more interesting, they're more challenging. I mean, we can imagine, remember all of the messages that were circulating about Hillary Clinton, many of which were untrue. Same in Nigeria. One of the most shared messages in the election contested by President Buhari, the last election he contested, was that he was actually dead and he had been replaced by a clone. Now, that sounds crazy. It sounds a bit ridiculous to people who don't understand the context, but the context was that actually previously in Nigeria, where a previous president, Yar'Adua, had died, the political elite had kind of covered that up for a while and covered up how unwell he was to try and put in place a kind of an understanding of what would happen and how they would manage the transition. And so it kept the public in the dark. People knew that President Buhari wasn't very well, and so this meme that he'd actually died, had been replaced by a lookalike, or he was incapacitated and replaced by a lookalike, played into this idea which has resonance because of this history of Nigerian presidential information about health being kept secret. So you can see that there's an ability to kind of spread messages that are way beyond the control of the ruling party, because you can hit on that nerve that makes something fly in a way that the ruling party often struggles to do. So I think at the beginning, that process did kind of empower opposition parties. First of all, to potentially put out messages out there that are also disinformation and hit back, but also to defend themselves and to debunk messages. But I think it's also true that that has shifted over time. My sense is that a lot of ruling parties were taken a bit by surprise. They are mostly, in my experience, run by quite old men. Quite old men are not very good at technology. Think about teaching your granddad to use Twitter for the first time. It's a little bit like that. So perhaps they underappreciated how dangerous this was going to be. But, and you used a great phrase there, it's an arms race, and they've caught up. So one of the things we now see, for example, is advisors from countries like China and other countries, technology companies like Hawaii and others, helping dictators to actually catch up, helping them to hack into the phones and the WhatsApp accounts of opposition leaders so that there isn't a protected way that opposition candidates can communicate, helping them to spread disinformation more effectively. And we also see the spread of really pernicious cybersecurity legislation, which is spread under the guise of protecting people online, but is really about enabling online censorship so that people feel too scared to put messages online. And those processes, I think, have started to really erode the emancipatory potential of this technology. And we risk going back to a point where this is now a technology that predominantly keeps governments in power rather than undermines their ability to control their citizens.
Over the period of the digital revolution, so over the last 30 years, you say there was a lot of optimism that this would be empowering for democracy. There's now a lot of pessimism, I think. And there is a general narrative, and you've touched on it, which is that we are living in a period of authoritarian strength, the growth of authoritarian regimes around the world, measured simply by the number. And a lot depends on where the threshold is, what the cutoff is. But there is, I think, a consensus almost that democracy is in retreat. But given the things that we've talked about, there are two ways of thinking about that, one of which is just the number of regimes that fall into different categories. And in political science terms, there are multiple different ways people describe these things: competitive authoritarianism and semi-free and so on. And The Economist often has maps of the world, and it's so complicated now, the different categories. It's not just free and unfree. It's this huge range. But you can put countries in different categories. But the other way you can think about it is just these techniques or these ways of fixing elections, they spread. So it's not simply that this country was once more democratic and now it's a bit less democratic, but that actually you can see these different ways of manipulating elections appearing in places that you had previously thought were pretty free and fair. And the United States is an example that will come onto that. In that middle ground, where it's kind of hard to say, is this really a authoritarian regime or does it have democratic elements? Do you think the way to think about this is that there is now a proliferation of these techniques? So what you're actually seeing in control of the media, the courts, civil society, the ways in which people are intimidated, the use of digital technology to basically stifle people's freedom of expression, that the way we should think about it is not mapping the regimes, but sort of tracking the techniques as they spread around the world?
I think that's right. Yeah, we could call them techniques, practices, right? Authoritarian practices. And I think that's a good way of thinking about it for two reasons. You can have authoritarian practices even in established democracies, right? But also it makes us think more, as you say, about the techniques and how they're used and how they spread more than just categorizing countries, which is more of a kind of dull, as you say, sort of bean counting exercise. And it is fascinating how we see different strategies being used in different places. So, first of all, as you say, we see strategies being adopted over time. We see clearly people learning from each other. A really good example of that would be legislation designed to cripple civil society. We have critical examples of this. Russia's foreign agent law, for example, big authoritarian countries that basically introduce legislation that makes it difficult to be independent civil society, that makes it very hard to receive international financial assistance if you're a civil society organization, essentially trying to cut the legs off from pro-human rights, pro-democracy civil society. And after those initial sort of moments of this legislation being introduced in high-profile ways, we saw over 100 countries around the world have versions of that legislation introduced into their parliaments. And in most of those cases, that legislation was successful. So civil society around the world today is much more hampered, much less free, much more intimidated and controlled than it was 20 years ago as a result of that diffusion of that kind of approach. But we also see really big differences, and I think this is something we don't talk about enough. So, in general, elections in most parts of the world are not great quality. That's a sad thing. And one of the real revelations we had when we started working on this was electoral manipulation is not the exception, it is the rule. Right? The countries that are actually having really good quality elections are in a minority now. But how elections are manipulated really varies according to region. So let me just give you a couple of examples. If we want to talk about elections with state targeting of the opposition with violence and intimidation, we collected the data on this across the world. And one of the things that we can see is that if you're in a post-Soviet country, so if you're in those post-communist states, something like 47% of all elections feature significant targeting of the opposition with violence, intimidation, and harassment. That figure drops to just 37% in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's much less actual use of violence and intimidation in Africa than the post-Soviet states. That's not an accident. I think it's actually because post-Soviet states are much more capable. You can control citizens more effectively with repressive mechanisms in those states because they developed much bigger coercive capacities and infrastructures under the Soviet Union than African states typically did. Conversely, if you want to talk about, for example, vote buying, how many elections are said by observers and others to include vote buying, that is at 67% in Africa. So that's over two-thirds of the elections. All elections feature significant vote buying, but it drops to just 44% in those post-Soviet states and then down to 29% in the Middle East. So we see really different strategies of electoral manipulation. In Africa, it seems like the kind of fact that leaders want to portray themselves as big men, as patrons, as clientelistic leaders who can deliver to citizens personally encourages vote buying. In the post-Soviet context, it's the fact that we've got strong states which are more coercive, which leads to higher levels of violence and repression. So what you're facing as an opposition candidate trying to win an election really does vary depending on where you are in the world and the kind of strategies that are being used to keep you out of power.
So I'm going to ask you a question. It's an unfair question because I'm aware there isn't just a straightforward answer to this, but the range of institutions that can be co-opted by ruling regimes include the judiciary and often supreme courts or the highest court in the land. Related but separate to that, it can include those institutions that are tasked with monitoring elections. So there are, in most countries, institutions whose job it is to see that the election is free and fair. There are the institutions of the media, news organizations, but also often national radio or TV stations, even in the internet age. TV still really matters. In lots of places, radio really matters. There are more broadly those civil society organizations. Which of those is the most important to hold on to as independent? If you see a country where, imagine a country where one or more of these could be co-opted by the ruling regime, which is the one that it's most important to have its independence preserved? Is it the judiciary in a country where courts can strike down election results or say something is unconstitutional? And I'm going to be coming on to the United States in a moment, so this is partly why question is being asked. Is it possible to say that there is a kind of a ditch in which you need to die if you're going to keep elections free and fair, and it is, say, an independent judiciary, or is it more complicated than that?
I think the judiciary is critical, but of course the judiciary can only act after an abuse has happened, right? The judiciary can come in and say that act was unconstitutional or actually hear an election petition, and most election complaints will go to the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court. So the judiciary is critical for that, but it can only act once an election has been manipulated. It can't stop the election being manipulated. So I think it's a critical part of the puzzle. And in countries like Kenya and Malawi recently, we've seen really interesting cases where the judiciary has actually broken ground, becoming some of the first countries around the world where the judiciary has actually nullified the election of a sitting president. That's super rare, right? Because that's about as confrontational and as independent as you can be as a judiciary, to actually say to the president, I'm sorry, Mr. President, the election that you won was not okay. We have to do it again. But it is very rare. And so I think although judicial independence is really important, the fact that it only comes after the fact, after the elections has been manipulated, means perhaps it's not the most fundamental institution. For me, obviously the most important one is the Electoral Commission itself. And if you've got an Electoral Commission that can withstand pressure and actually say these were the votes counted and these are the results, that is the most important thing. Because a lot of what we've been talking about, is it possible for the opposition to win? Is it possible that the ruling party could be sort of surprised? Comes down to the fact that at some point the head of the Electoral Commission is going to have to announce the results. And are they willing to announce the results of the votes that were actually cast? And I think sometimes we think about this in a kind of cut and dried way. It's either an independent commission or it's not an independent commission. In most cases I see it's neither one or the other. It's somewhere in the middle. And it's also paying attention to how big are the results and what is the reaction of the citizenry going to be. So I've seen electoral commissions that I thought before the election were flawed and co-opted, announced that the opposition won. And I think the reason they announced the opposition won was because the opposition won so many votes that they decided that actually to be on the side of history, but also to look after their own self-interest, it made more sense to announce an opposition victory and be on the side of that change and then to be favoured by the new government than to actually try and rig the election for the government. And that's why I think one of the things that we often forget is that institutions don't operate in isolation. They're also impacted by the extent of public protest, the public pressure they're placed under, the messages they're getting from other people within civil society around the elections. And that struggle to kind of get the Electoral Commission and the judiciary to do the right thing, that's a really important struggle that can shape whether they do their job or not. So for me, it would be the Electoral Commission, and then secondary, the judiciary would be the critical institutions. If you're going to die in a ditch for elections, die in a ditch for those two.
Do external observers make much difference? So people who come in to monitor elections to see if they're free and fair, does that have much teeth anymore? Did it ever have teeth?
I think they do. I think observation is really important because it makes it harder to manipulate elections, and it means that if you do things badly, you're more likely to get exposed. So I think observation is really important, but we have to go back to, in a sense, what I said about the judiciary. Most people don't understand this, but observers only observe. They cannot intervene. So if you're an observer and you're observing an election in a country, wherever it is in the world, you can't, if you see someone stuffing a ballot box, stop them. You can't go up and say, I see you're stuffing this ballot box, I'm going to call the Electoral Commission. Your job is to write down on your form that ballot box stuffing occurred, not to intervene. So again, you can tell us after the result comes out that you saw really bad problems and really bad manipulation all across the country. You can tell us that that election was not free and fair. You can't actually stop it in real time. The second thing that I think we have to keep in mind about observers is, especially international observers, have to play quite a careful game. They are invited by governments to be there, and what they say will be scrutinized in some ways even more closely than the election results themselves. So they're desperate to find results that they can prove and demonstrate empirically. And a lot of what we know about electoral manipulation is difficult to prove in a way that would stand up in a court of law. I would say that there were elections that I know were manipulated, but I would would really struggle to prove are manipulated. And I think one of the things that's happened to observers recently is they've been caught in a situation where they didn't quite have the evidence to say the election was rigged, so they pulled their punches. And then citizens of that country say, hang on, we know that election was problematic. We understand the ways it was done. You know how it was done. Why are you pulling your punches? You're actually legitimating a process that was illegitimate. So we've actually seen, for example, in cases like Kenya in 2017, the observers didn't say the election was completely flawed. The courts then ruled it out. Malawi 2019, the observers didn't say it was completely flawed. The courts then ruled it out. So the role of international observation has become increasingly controversial. And I think one of the things we need to think about if we want to make observation more effective moving forward is how do we make it easier for observers to make critical statements about the elections, even in cases where they can't prove everything? Because otherwise there's going to be constantly this tension between a more kind of legalistic, technocratic attempt to get the evidence and what citizens know is actually happening in their own countries.
So now I want to ask you about three countries as we move towards the freer and fairer end of the spectrum, but no one is perfect. But start with one in the middle, because it's often held up as the new model of a kind of hybrid regime, which is Hungary under Orban. Where would you place Hungary on that spectrum? We know that many politicians in the United States have looked at Hungary, Republican politicians, and sought to learn, as these techniques spread. Is Orban's Hungary a country you think that the opposition can plausibly hope to win an election in?
That's a tough question. I think we've seen over the last 10 years a consolidation of power around Orban, both in terms of his relationship to other democratic institutions like the courts and the legislature, and in terms of the extent to which his party controls the media and what happens in society, that I would say that it's become progressively more authoritarian and more controlled. That said, it is still a context in which we can see, I think, the government being embarrassed by election results, and in which we can see potentially, if, for example, economic decline combined with scandals within the ruling party, a deterioration of support and the vote that would be hard for the government to mask. But I do think we're getting towards a point where it will be extremely difficult for the opposition to secure, a victory that removes Orban from power. We are moving in that direction. We're not fully there yet.
And presumably it's still one of those regimes, because after all, one of the things you can do if an election is coming up and you think you're not going to do as well as you would like is to cancel the election. I mean, cancelling elections is a thing that autocrats can do. Were Orban to be facing an election and suddenly to feel this isn't going the way I hoped, he would still have to hold it. I mean, that is one of the very minimal tests, isn't it? That you might be able to delay it. I don't know enough about Hungary to know about the scope for delaying it, but elections are not going to be abolished there if they look like they're not going the way the ruling regime would like.
One of the things we try to do is to put ourselves in the mind of the dictator, right? Let's think about from their point of view. If I was Orban and I had a choice between completely abolishing elections or delaying elections or trying to find other ways to rig the election, I would always be trying to find other ways to rig the election. Then maybe delaying and only at the very end cancelling. Because cancelling is basically admitting that you're not popular, right? It's also admitting that you're a dictator. And a lot of leaders who are dictators around the world want to claim democratic legitimacy. Many of their parties have the word democracy right there in the title. They want to claim that they won elections, that it's important to their sense of themselves. It's really interesting to see that a lot of the leaders around the world who want to do undemocratic things do it legally. What I mean by that is they pass legislation that enables them to abuse their citizens. They pass legislation that removes term limits because they want to be seen to be orderly and respectable individuals. So I think he would wait on that side. It's also true that there's an awful lot you can do, as we've been talking about, right, to manipulate the elections, to give yourself a victory, even if you lose significant popularity within the country. The other thing that I think is worth saying, though, and this is a tough thing to say because, it goes against the grain of what, some people would want us to argue. We have to keep in mind that authoritarian leaders like Orban are also quite good at mobilizing a certain section of society behind them. So it's important to say that when we're talking about election rigging, we're not talking about leaders that are trying to rig every single vote. The smartest dictators know that what you want to do is mobilize 45% of the vote through people actually liking you and supporting you, and mobilize the rest if you need to through rigging. But if you get down to 20, 15% of the vote and you're having to rig 40, 50% of the vote through rigging, that's an incredibly expensive effort. It's a very risky effort. And it also means it's going to be obvious for citizens. And one of the things that Orban has obviously been good at is finding particular issues and ways of appealing to certain sections of society that have actually boosted his popularity and enabled him to win the election in the first place, right? He came to power through a legitimate election and then in power has moved increasingly towards that undemocratic direction. And sometimes I think we don't pay enough attention to, what are the strategies through which authoritarian leaders are trying to sustain their own support. Now, that might include, disinformation, but it might also include, appeals to certain sections of society, populist appeals maybe, returns to conservative values that we as Democrats and liberals find very uncomfortable or distasteful or in some cases, just plain wrong, but actually have some resonance within sections of society. And we shouldn't downplay how effective that combination is, right? Disinformation, populist politics, and electoral manipulation at the same time. That's a really effective strategy, and much more effective than just relying on rigging alone.
That, I think, leads on to my next country, which is the United States. So where do you think we are now in 2025 when looking at American democracy, electoral democracy, we're talking about here, a country that has more elections than anywhere else in the world at every level, but also is under severe strain at some of those levels. I don't think at all of them. Where would you place the United States on that spectrum now?
I think one thing we have to say at the beginning, and I know it's not the world's most satisfying answer, right, is that you don't know until a system is tested. I've often said this about countries that people have told me, oh, this is a democratic country, but we've never seen a transfer of power. I always feel like, well, let's wait until we see whether the ruling party is really willing to go, and then we'll see. And so at the minute, I think we have very good reasons to be worried about the independence of, for example, the Supreme Court in the United States, to worry about the pressure that will be put on state-level electoral authorities around the elections, the vote-buying practices that may happen ahead of the elections. We have big reasons to worry about all of those. And I do think we're getting to a point where we can't just talk about the United States as a democracy. We have to talk about the ways in which it's autocratizing. But it's also true that it won't be really very easy to work out exactly what that means until we see how key individuals and key institutions react on election day. And that means that actually, in some ways, we're going to be in a kind of murky middle ground where we know the United States is less democratic than it was, but we don't know exactly how problematic that has become. And one reason I say that is because, one of the things that's really unique about the United States across a lot of the countries that I look at is that it has a decentralized electoral system. So if I want to rig an election in Russia, if I wanted to rig it in Zimbabwe, wherever else, I would basically know that if I nobbled the chair of the Electoral Commission and key figures from the Electoral Commission, when the votes come in, I can get them to change it and announce something else. Trump cannot do that because the electoral system is controlled mostly under a system regulated by the federal government, but is controlled by the states. And so key issues around how people vote, what kind of ballot papers they have, are decided by the states. And the process of actually collecting and tallying those votes will be conducted at the state level. So Trump can't simply manipulate the elections by nobbling the Electoral Commission as you might do in another country. What you would actually have to do is coordinate electoral manipulation among Republican allied states who are willing to assist you in manipulating the process. If we're talking, for example, as we were going back to the beginning of the conversation, about actually preventing a victory for, the other party, rather than just using vote buying, etc., to give a little bit of an advantage. And so I don't think we're going to really know until we get to election day how those state level processes will stand up, how independent they will be, how impervious they will be to that pressure. And one of the things that really worries me at the minute is that one of the things that I know happens around elections around the world is that the people that we were talking about before, the judiciary, the electoral commission staff, start to come under really intense political pressure. Most people I know who've been in those roles receive daily death threats during the electoral process from unnamed numbers they had never received messages from before, pictures of bullets, pictures of Kalashnikovs, people basically trying to intimidate them to do something one way or another. And we know in the United States already that we're starting to to see some of that kind of violence and hostility directed against people who are seen to be anti-Trump at different levels of the political system. So the context we could be going into is, and this doesn't, I'm not saying this is directed by Trump. This could be just people who are affiliated, supported, thinking that they're doing something helpful. But we could go into an election with intense pressure from Trump on officials to do things in a certain way. See, his recent treatment of, for example, officials within his government, key economic officials in the United States, who he's basically saying should resign. That sort of intense top-down pressure being married to massive bottom-up pressure and intimidation and death threats coming from below. And in that context, electoral officials having to decide whether to announce the results that they believe were correct or whether to change those results in some kind of way that favors Trump. And of course, this isn't going to happen nationally because in the United States, again, it's not a straightforward presidential election. It's not who wins the most votes that matters. It's who gets the most electoral college votes. And that means that this is actually going to come down to certain swing states that Trump is going to know he needs to win the electoral college, even if he doesn't win the national vote. And so I think we really need to start talking about how are those particular states going to hold up if we want to talk about the prospects for the US election passing safely, peacefully, credibly.
So we're assuming it won't be Trump himself. If it is Trump himself, we're in a new era anyway. But as you say, you don't know where you are until the system has been tested. Well, the American system was tested, I think, pretty robustly in 2020, 2021. Now, you might say we're in a different era and a re-elected Trump represents a very different kind of political beast than he was in his first term. But nonetheless, are you not given some reassurance by the way in which, when it was tested in December 2020, January 2021, it did pass that test? Or do you think, in a way, that's history now?
Two quick points there. One, I think the second term in office is often when we start to see the authoritarian movements and parties really consolidate. So we were talking about Orban recently, right? Orban, term one, was very different to what we saw after Orban was re-elected. All of a sudden, we seem to see a different game plan, a much more ambitious, aggressive game plan. And we've seen that also with Trump, right? The Trump agenda that we've seen since re-election, along with the connection to heritage and the plan, all of that has been much more directed, much more aggressive than Trump won. So I think that there are good reasons to be much more worried about the position we're in the United States today than during the first Trump administration. And the extent to which there's been a comprehensive plan and an agenda indicates that there's much more attention to detail this time around. So I think we should be more concerned than we were before. Second, though, it really does depend on the relationship between Trump and the new candidate. Because if Trump gets to handpick a successor that he has total confidence in and he believes will protect his interests, he has great incentives to use all of his power to try and get that person elected. If somehow someone comes through that Trump is less enamored with, and we have to keep in mind how quickly, for example, he fell out with Elon Musk, if somebody comes through that he thinks he can trust, but who then does something during the campaign trail he doesn't like, we might have the bizarre situation of, the Republican president actually not necessarily being fully committed to the election of the Republican candidate, and then that top-down political pressure would be much weaker. And one of the things we actually see around the world is that elections where the sitting president does not stand, so what we as political scientists would call open seat elections, where a president has died in office or a president has to stand down because of term limits, those elections are often more free and fair than the elections where the president stands, and they often see a greater chance of opposition victory. And the reason, of course, is that when the president is standing down and not contesting the elections, they're less likely to use repression, vote buying, intimidation to try and keep themselves in power, because they're less invested in their successor winning power than they were in themselves. So it's also possible that complication of having to find a new candidate, that disrupts that process, and we actually see a better quality election than some people fear.
And I don't think it'll happen in the American case, but it's not completely outside the bounds of possibility. The worst signal there would be a family member. I think we can agree in all of these cases when it's the son, that's a very different ballgame from in other cases.
But I think I could actually trump you on this one, if I'm allowed to say that, which is that I think the even worse outcome would be starting to hear more stories and rumors than we have so far about some sort of an attempt at a third term. Right? And, we shouldn't be completely rejecting that idea. It's very unlikely. It's much more likely that he tries to do it, as you say, through controlling the succession process. But we are in a context around the world in which an increasing number of leaders have sought to remove presidential term limits to get themselves in power. And one of the things that you do in order to be able to do that is you start to manipulate the judiciary, you start to manipulate the legislature, etc., on the way to doing that. Now, it seems implausible in the United States that will happen because of the way in which term limits would have to be removed and the support Trump would need across the country, which he doesn't currently have. But it is something that I think we need to keep in mind. Those kinds of conversations are also a really good signal that we should expect a really poor quality election or problems around the election coming up.
The last British general election that saw the Labour Party return with a very big majority, and there are things to be said about that we have discussed in other episodes of this series to do with electoral systems and results that look unbalanced. But leaving all that aside, can we straightforwardly say that the last British general election was free and fair and just move on? Or are there things that we should be concerned about?
I think there are things we should be concerned about. I often like to start my lectures on election rigging around the world by asking, what is the country in which every single major party has been reprimanded for breaking expenditure regulations in the last 5 years? And the answer is the United Kingdom. So we have a situation where parties are fairly routinely able to break regulations without significant punishment. We've actually seen the UK Electoral Commission speak out on this and talk about the fact that the punishments aren't severe enough to act as a deterrent. Parties are actually breaking the rules, knowing that the fines are so small, you might as well pay the fine and bank on it and therefore not follow the regulations to start with. It's not a massive issue because, in the sense that financial expenditure in the UK is so much smaller than it would be somewhere like the United States. But still, that's something to be concerned about. Beyond that, of course, the UK recently introduced voter ID. And one of the, weird and interesting things about the voter ID introduction is that it appears to have had the exact opposite effect that the government that introduced it wanted it to. So one of the things we know about voter ID is that it's often designed to solve a problem that doesn't exist, right? It's often introduced in countries where we don't have any evidence of high levels of manipulation by voter fraud, by people impersonating somebody else, or by young people voting when they shouldn't be allowed to. And it's used because the party in power thinks that voter ID will stop certain types of people from voting. So we know that lower income groups, often ethnic minorities, etc., people who've been to prison and so on, those people are less likely to have the documents you need to actually be able to prove who you are, and therefore voter ID reduces turnout amongst those people. So the introduction of that mechanism, when there was no concern about voter fraud in the UK, was seen by many people, obviously, as an attempt to create a situation where the Conservative Party would do better and it would depress the vote of the Labour Party. And we actually know this because Jacob Rees-Mogg, who of course was a former government minister, actually made a really interesting speech to the Electoral Reform Society where he basically implied that the Conservatives assumed that they were going to benefit from this and then found out, in his words, and I quote, that it came back to bite them. As I dare, we found by insisting on voter ID for elections, in fact, we found out that the people who didn't have ID were elderly and they were by and large Conservative supporters. So this is an interesting example about how potentially an attempt to sway the election by stopping certain people from voting would actually benefit the Conservative Party and ended up not benefiting them. But the broader point is that those kind of ID restrictions may actually keep more people away from the polls. And one thing we haven't talked enough about today, and maybe we just leave this for people to think about moving forwards, is that there is still really worrying efforts at voter suppression. Right, in many democracies around the world, we still know that ethnic minorities and poorer income groups are often less likely to turn out to vote. And one reason for that is often that it's made increasingly difficult for them to participate in politics rather than easier. And so the fact that in the UK, in a sense, we made it harder for those groups to participate rather than easier than those groups to participate means that I think we should have serious concerns about the last election. Even if we don't think that they had any impact whatsoever on the outcome, they did have an impact on the ability of people to express their democratic rights. And that's as important as a component of elections as who wins them.
And as you said, in the United States, there's top-down pressure, there's bottom-up pressure, but there's also what you might call the sideways exclusion. And in a way, I think in the United States, we've seen as much of that as the other two as well. It's an open field, and there's all sorts of countervailing forces as well pushing back, because civil society is still very robust in the United States, and the courts, particularly at the lower levels, still offer a lot of protection. But nonetheless, the history of American democracy is inseparably intertwined with the history of voter suppression. Let me put it like that.
Absolutely. And it continues in really worrying ways, right? I mean, so not only do we have, systematic attempts to stop Black people from fully participating in politics, extending, into what's often thought of as a civil rights era, but, voter suppression and efforts to intimidate or stop or confuse certain kinds of voters and stop them coming to the polls have been prevalent in recent elections. And let us not forget that in the really important Bush versus Gore election, the 2000 election, with all of the controversy, there was a big question mark about whether or not there had been voter suppression of minority communities within Florida that had swayed the election result in Florida. So these are issues that are really prevalent today, and they may well be issues that come up in the next election. If you want to sort of control an election like the United States, where it's much harder to rig through, managing the Electoral Commission and rigging through fixing the results, the way that you would do it would be through disinformation, vote buying, and disenfranchising those voters you're assuming are voting for the other side. And so if they really do want to do it, these will be the mechanisms that we will start to see ramping up. And that could be one of the biggest areas of division that we see around the elections. And of course, those divisive strategies are particularly important because they won't just undermine the credibility of the election in the eyes of the people who lose, they will also trigger fresh rounds of political instability.
Our live events are coming up thick and fast, and the third film in our film season at the Regent Street Cinema in London is going to be happening on Thursday, the 9th of October. The film is the biopic of Rosa Luxemburg, and my guest is going to be PPF regular Leah Ippey, who is passionate about that film and about Rosa Luxemburg. This one has seen a lot of demand for tickets, but there are still some available. And if you would like to join us, you know what to do. Click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. Leah and I would love to see you there. We're going to take a brief pause from fixing democracy for our occasional series that we are calling Now and Then with Robert Saunders, our regular PPF guide to British politics and to some of the anniversaries that really resonate from the past to the present to the future. I'm going to be talking to Robert on the 40th anniversary of one of the most important speeches in recent British political history, Neil Kinnock's speech at the Labour Party conference about militant tendency, and the fight for the soul of the Labour Party. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.